The brass key was small enough to fit in the palm of your hand, tarnished green from 4 years of exposure to limestone and groundwater seepage, and it shouldn't have been where plumber Antonio Reyes found it, wedged into a crack in the foundation of the equipment building at Devil's Den Spring in Williston, Florida. Antonio had been called to fix a persistent water leak that had been damaging the building's concrete pad, and when he'd excavated down to expose the foundation, his shovel had struck something metallic that rang with a sound that didn't belong in dirt. He'd pulled out the key, brushed off the mud, and was about to toss it in his toolbox when he noticed the tag attached to it by a small chain, a laminated piece of paper with writing that was still legible despite years underground. Locker 47. Property of Madison Cruz. If found, please call 352-555-147. Antonio had been working maintenance and plumbing jobs around Levy County for 15 years, long enough to know the name Madison Cruz and the story that went with it. She'd been one of 3 technical cave divers who'd vanished at Devil's Den in February 2020, a case that had made national news because it seemed impossible for experienced divers to disappear in a site that was considered relatively benign by cave diving standards. The spring was a popular training location, a collapsed karst sinkhole with crystal-clear water that dropped to 60 feet and connected to a small cave system that had been thoroughly mapped and marked with permanent guideline. It wasn't the kind of place where people died, or at least it hadn't been until Madison Cruz, her dive partner Kyle Brennan, and their instructor Garrett Walsh had entered the water on a February afternoon and never surfaced. Antonio pulled out his phone and called the number on the tag, not really expecting it to work after 4 years, but feeling like he owed it to whoever had been looking for Madison to try. The phone rang 3 times before someone answered, a woman's voice that sounded younger than Antonio expected. "This is Alexis Cruz." The words came out cautious, the tone of someone who'd learned to be suspicious of unexpected calls. Antonio introduced himself, explained he was a plumber working at Devil's Den, and said he'd found something that belonged to Madison Cruz. There was a long silence on the other end, and then Alexis said in a voice that wasn't quite steady, "Madison was my sister. She's been missing for 4 years. What did you find?" Antonio described the key and its location, and Alexis asked him not to touch anything else, to call the Levy County Sheriff's Office immediately, and to tell them that evidence related to the Devil's Den disappearance had been found. She'd be there in 90 minutes, she said, driving from Gainesville, where she taught marine biology at the University of Florida. She'd spent 4 years trying to understand what happened to her sister and the 2 men who'd been with her, and if this key meant something, she needed to see it herself. The deputy who responded was a man named Travis Holt, who'd been with the Levy County Sheriff's Office for 8 years and remembered the Devil's Den case well. It'd been one of the strangest investigations he'd worked. 3 experienced divers vanishing without a trace in a relatively small, well-mapped underwater space that had been searched repeatedly by some of the best cave divers in the world. The official conclusion had been accidental death by drowning, the bodies presumably trapped somewhere in the cave system beyond where recovery teams could safely search. But nobody had been satisfied with that explanation. Least of all, the families who'd spent years pushing for additional investigation. Holt examined the key where Antonio had found it, photographing the excavation site and the crack in the foundation where the key had been hidden. Hidden was the right word, he thought. The key wasn't just lost or dropped. It had been deliberately placed in a crevice and covered with dirt and limestone fragments in a way that suggested someone had concealed it intentionally. Why would a diver hide their locker key in the foundation of a building before going diving? Unless they weren't planning to come back, or unless they knew something was wrong and wanted to leave evidence for someone to find. Holt carefully extracted the key using gloved hands, sealed it in an evidence bag, and expanded his search of the area around the equipment building. If Madison had hidden the key, maybe she'd hidden other things. He brought in a K9 unit trained in cadaver detection. Though he didn't really expect to find bodies here, the dogs would also alert to personal effects that had been in close contact with human remains, and that might be useful. The dog handler, a woman named Officer Kendra Marsh, worked her German Shepherd around the building's perimeter, and the dog alerted twice, once near where the key had been found, and once at the base of a limestone outcropping about 20 feet away. Holt marked both spots and called for a forensic team from the Florida Department of Law Enforcement, explaining that he might have evidence related to a 4-year-old missing persons case. While they waited for FDLE to arrive, Alexis Cruz pulled into the parking lot in a Honda Civic that had seen better days, and she introduced herself to Holt with a handshake that was firmer than he expected. She was 28, looked like she hadn't been sleeping well, and she had her sister's eyes according to the photos Holt had seen in the case file. She asked to see where the key was found, and Holt walked her over to the excavation site, explaining what Antonio had discovered and how the key had been concealed. Alexis looked at the spot for a long time without speaking, and then she said something that made Holt's investigation shift direction entirely. Madison always left a key hidden when she was going somewhere dangerous. It was her insurance policy, she'd say. If something went wrong, if she didn't come back, there'd be evidence for someone to find. She'd done it on other dives, other trips into caves where the risks were high. She'd leave a key or a note or some kind of marker hidden in a place that was unlikely to be discovered by accident, but that would eventually be found if someone looked. This was Madison telling us something went wrong, Alexis said. This was her trying to leave a trail. The FDLE forensic team arrived 90 minutes later with ground-penetrating radar equipment and excavation tools. They worked methodically, scanning the area where the K9 had alerted and carefully removing soil in layers. At the first alert location near the foundation, they found a waterproof pouch buried 6 inches down, sealed with duct tape and containing items that made the investigation suddenly much more complicated. Inside the pouch was a dive computer, the kind technical divers wore to track depth, time, and decompression obligations. It was Madison Cruz's computer, according to the serial number on the back. Next to it was a folded piece of waterproof paper with handwriting that was clear despite obvious moisture exposure. And most significantly, there was a small digital voice recorder, the kind journalists used, with a full memory card. Holt opened the note first, reading aloud for Alexis and the FDLE team. February 14th, 2020. If you're reading this, something went wrong with today's dive, and we didn't make it back. The dive plan Garrett filed with the spring management isn't real. He's planning something different, something dangerous, and Kyle and I are worried, but he's the instructor, and he convinced us it would be okay. We're going beyond the cavern zone, into a restriction Garrett says he's explored before, but that isn't on any maps. He says there's a room on the other side with formations nobody's ever photographed. He says it'll make his reputation, get him sponsored, change everything. Kyle wanted to back out, but Garrett said we'd lose our certifications if we refused to complete the training dive. I don't think that's true, but I don't know enough to argue. I'm leaving this in case we don't come back. The recorder has our dive plan discussion from this morning. Please find us. Tell my mom and Alexis I love them. Madison. The implications were staggering. Garrett Walsh, the instructor who'd been portrayed in news coverage as a victim of the same mysterious accident that took his students, had apparently pressured them into a dive that deviated significantly from the filed plan. If the recorder contained evidence of that conversation, it would transform the investigation from accidental death to potential criminal negligence, or worse. Holt handled the recorder carefully, knowing it would need to be processed properly to maintain chain of custody. He called the Levy County Sheriff directly, explained what had been found, and requested that the Devil's Den case be reopened as a potential homicide investigation. While they waited for authorization to proceed, Holt asked Alexis what she knew about Garrett Walsh and the dive plan filed on the day of the disappearance. Alexis pulled out a folder she'd been carrying, documentation she'd assembled over 4 years of private investigation into her sister's death. The official dive plan filed with Devil's Den management showed a simple overhead environment dive in the cavern zone. Maximum depth 40 feet, duration 60 minutes, staying within sight of natural light. It was the kind of dive that shouldn't have been dangerous for divers with Madison and Kyle's certification levels. But Alexis had never believed that's what they'd actually done, because Madison's training logs showed she'd been working toward full cave certification, which required multiple dives in progressively more challenging cave environments. A simple cavern dive wouldn't have advanced her training at all. Alexis had researched Garrett Walsh extensively. He'd been a cave diving instructor for 12 years, certified through the National Speleological Society Cave Diving Section and the International Association of Nitrox and Technical Divers. His record was mostly clean with good student evaluations, but Alexis had found hints of trouble. In 2018, Walsh had been involved in an incident at Ginny Springs, where a student had suffered a panic attack during a cave dive that exceeded the parameters in the filed dive plan. The student had survived, but filed a complaint, saying Walsh had pressured him to do a dive he wasn't comfortable with. The complaint had been investigated, but ultimately dismissed due to insufficient evidence. Walsh had continued teaching, and by 2020, he had a reputation as an instructor who pushed boundaries, who trained aggressive divers, who could handle challenging situations. Madison had been drawn to that reputation, Alexis said. She'd wanted to be a full cave diver, wanted to explore systems that few people ever saw. She'd been working toward that goal for 2 years, taking courses and building experience. Kyle Brennan had similar goals, though he was more cautious by nature. The two of them had signed up for Garrett Walsh's advanced cave diving course in January 2020, paying $3,000 each for a week of intensive training that would culminate in certification dives at various cave systems around North Florida. Devil's Den was supposed to be the easiest site, a warm-up before more challenging dives at places like Peacock Springs and Madison Blue. But they'd never made it past Devil's Den. On February 14th, Valentine's Day, Walsh had taken Madison and Kyle to the spring for what he told management was a simple cavern dive. They'd entered the water at 2:30 p.m., according to the logbook at the front desk. The spring was relatively crowded that day, with open water divers doing training and certification, so nobody had paid particular attention to 3 divers in technical gear. When Walsh, Madison and Kyle didn't surface by 4 p.m., the spring staff had assumed they'd extended their dive time and would be up soon. By 4:30 p.m., when there was still no sign of them, staff had called 911 and initiated emergency protocols. The subsequent search operation had been massive, involving over 40 technical divers from multiple agencies and private dive teams. They'd searched every accessible part of the cave system, following all known passages, checking every side tunnel and restriction. They'd found nothing. No bodies, no equipment, no sign that 3 divers had ever been there. The only evidence of their presence was the signatures in the logbook and their vehicles in the parking lot. It was as though they'd entered the water and simply ceased to exist. The theories at the time had been limited by lack of evidence. Maybe they'd gotten lost in a collapse that blocked their exit and sealed them into an unexplored section. Maybe they'd suffered equipment failure simultaneously, unlikely but not impossible with rental gear or poorly maintained regulators. Maybe they'd violated safety protocols and penetrated beyond their gas supply, dying from hypoxia in a passage too tight for recovery. The official report had listed cause of death as drowning by unknown mechanism, bodies unrecovered, case suspended pending new evidence. Now they had new evidence. The FDLE team transported the dive computer and voice recorder to their lab in Tallahassee, where technical specialists could extract data without risking damage. Holt coordinated with the sheriff's office to assemble an investigative team, and by the following morning they had authorization to treat the disappearance as a potential homicide. The lead investigator assigned was a detective named Maria Santos, who specialized in underwater death investigations and had worked several cave diving fatalities over her 15-year career with FDLE. She'd reviewed the original Devil's Den case file 4 years earlier when it was fresh, and she'd noted then that something felt wrong about the circumstances, even though she couldn't identify what. The dive computer data was recovered first, and it told a story that contradicted everything in the filed dive plan. Madison's computer showed she'd descended to 72 feet, far deeper than the cavern zone at Devil's Den extended. The dive had lasted 93 minutes, 30 minutes longer than planned, and the depth profile showed multiple ascents and descents, suggesting the team had been navigating through restrictions and vertical passages rather than doing a simple cavern tour. Most significantly, the computer's internal compass showed bearing changes that indicated extensive horizontal penetration, the kind of navigation you'd do in a complex cave system. But Devil's Den's mapped cave system only extended about 300 feet from the main chamber, and it didn't have passages at 72 feet. The spring's deepest point was 60 feet at the bottom of the sinkhole, and the caves branched horizontally from there at depths of 30 to 50 feet. If Madison had been at 72 feet for any length of time, she wasn't in the known cave system. She was somewhere else, somewhere that shouldn't exist according to every map and survey that had been done of Devil's Den over 40 years of diving activity. Detective Santos assembled a team of cave diving experts to review the computer data and provide consultation. The team included representatives from the NSS Cave Diving Section, the International Underwater Cave Rescue and Recovery Team, and several instructors who'd been teaching at Florida cave sites for decades. They met at FDLE headquarters and spent 6 hours analyzing the dive profile, comparing it to known cave systems, and trying to understand where Madison crews could have been diving that would produce that depth and navigation pattern. The consensus was troubling. The experts agreed that the dive profile was consistent with exploration diving in an unmapped cave system, probably accessed through an unexplored restriction or gap that connected Devil's Den to a deeper system. Such connections existed throughout Florida's karst limestone, some documented and many still unknown. Divers occasionally found new passages that connected systems previously thought separate, and exploration of these connections was one of the most dangerous activities in cave diving. It required skills and equipment beyond what typical recreational or even advanced divers possessed, and it was regulated by strict protocols designed to minimize fatalities. Garrett Walsh would have known those protocols, the expert said, and he would have known that taking students into unexplored cave systems violated every standard in the industry. If Walsh had found or suspected a new passage at Devil's Den and had taken Madison and Kyle through it, he'd been conducting an unauthorized exploration dive using students as support divers. That was criminal negligence at minimum, possibly reckless endangerment or involuntary manslaughter depending on what the voice recorder revealed about his intentions and their consent. The voice recorder data was extracted next, and Detective Santos listened to it alone first, taking notes before sharing it with the team. The recording was 73 minutes long, starting with conversation in the parking lot at Devil's Den, and ending with what sounded like breathing through a regulator and muffled voices distorted by water. Santos transcribed the key segments, and what emerged was a picture of an instructor pressuring reluctant students into a dive they didn't feel prepared for. The recording started with Madison's voice, presumably speaking into the recorder she'd concealed in her pocket. February 14th, 7:15 a.m. We're meeting Garrett at Devil's Den this afternoon for what's supposed to be a cavern dive, but he called last night and said he has something special planned. He wouldn't give details over the phone, just said to bring our full cave gear and extra gas. Kyle and I are both worried. This doesn't feel right. But Garrett's the instructor. He's got hundreds of cave dives, and we're just students. I'm recording this conversation when we meet him, just in case. The next clear segment was recorded at Devil's Den, in the parking lot before they geared up. Garrett Walsh's voice was confident, authoritative, the tone of someone used to being obeyed. "Okay, team, here's the real plan for today. I've been exploring a restriction at the back of the main chamber, about 50 feet deep on the north wall. It's tight, maybe 18 inches, but it opens into a passage that drops to a room I've been mapping over the past month. The room is incredible, formations like nothing else in Florida, and I want to document it properly with photographers who can handle technical diving. That's you two. We're going to spend about an hour in the room, get photos and video, and then come back. The restriction is tight but manageable if you stay calm." Kyle's voice came next, hesitant. "Garrett, this sounds like exploration diving. We're not certified for that. And we'd need permits, and we'd need to file this dive plan with the spring." And Madison's voice cut in. "We'd need more gas than we have staged. Garrett, I only brought enough for the cavern dive you told us about. If we're going to 70 feet for an hour, I need more bottom mix, and I need decompression gas. This isn't safe." Garrett's response was dismissive. "I've done this dive 6 times. I know the navigation, I've placed temporary line, and I have extra gas staged at the restriction exit. You'll both stay on my guideline, you'll follow my lead, and you'll be fine. This is what cave diving is about, pushing boundaries, exploring new territory. If you want to be cave divers instead of just playing in the cavern zone, this is how you learn. And yes, technically we should file a new dive plan, but if we do that, the spring management will shut us down. They don't allow exploration diving without special permission, which takes months to get. We can file paperwork after the fact if we find something significant." Madison's voice was firmer now. "I'm not comfortable with this. This violates everything I've learned about cave diving safety. We don't exceed our training, we don't dive without proper planning, and we don't enter unmapped caves without support divers on the surface. Garrett, I want to do this dive eventually, but not today. Let's get the permits. Let's plan it properly." Garrett's tone changed, became harder. "Let me be clear about something. I'm the instructor. I'm responsible for your certification. If you refuse to complete training dives I assign, that's a failed evaluation, and you don't get certified. You've each paid $3,000 and invested months of training time. You want to throw that away because you're scared of a restriction. This is a test of your mental toughness, your ability to handle stress and make decisions underwater. Kyle, you're doing this dive. Madison, you're doing this dive. We're going to make history today, and you're going to thank me when you see what's down there." There was a long silence, and then Kyle's voice. "Quiet. Okay, I'll do it." Madison's voice followed after another pause. "I'll do it. But I'm leaving a record of this conversation. If something goes wrong, people need to know this wasn't our decision." Garrett's laugh was audible. "Nothing's going wrong, trust me. Let's gear up." The recording continued through equipment checks and final preparations, and then there was the sound of water, breathing through regulators, and occasional muffled voices that were impossible to understand clearly. The recording ended at timestamp 73:24, presumably when the recorder's memory filled, or when Madison had turned it off, or when something had interrupted the recording. Santos played the ending segment repeatedly, trying to hear what the muffled voices were saying, but the water distortion made it impossible to extract clear words. All she could determine was that someone had been speaking urgently, tone suggesting stress or alarm in the final 30 seconds before the recording stopped. Santos assembled the full investigative team and played the recording for them, watching their reactions. Several of the cave diving experts looked physically ill by the time Garrett Walsh's voice came through, pressuring the students. One instructor, a man named David Pell, who'd been teaching cave diving for 30 years, said flatly that Walsh should have been prosecuted for what he'd done, even if everyone had survived. Taking uncertified students into an unexplored cave without proper planning or support was criminally reckless, Pell said. It's the kind of thing that gets people killed and gives the entire sport a black eye. If Walsh pressured them, and they died as a result, that's manslaughter minimum, possibly second-degree murder, depending on how the prosecutor wants to charge it. But Walsh was presumably dead too, lost in the same cave system that had claimed Madison and Kyle. Unless he wasn't. Santos had been reviewing the original case file, and she'd noted something that bothered her. Walsh's vehicle had been found in the parking lot at Devil's Den, along with Madison's and Kyle's, but Walsh's wallet and keys had been inside his truck, locked, as though he'd put them away before diving. That was normal behavior. What wasn't normal was that Walsh's wallet contained his credit cards, his driver's license, and $600 in cash. Divers usually left valuables locked in vehicles, but most people didn't carry that much cash to a dive site. It suggested Walsh had been planning for something, maybe a quick exit or a payment to someone. Santos requested a full financial audit of Garrett Walsh's accounts in the months leading up to the disappearance. The audit revealed interesting patterns. Walsh had withdrawn $10,000 in cash over January and early February 2020 in increments of $500 to $1,000, always from ATMs not near his home or the dive sites where he taught. He'd also taken out a $20,000 personal loan 2 weeks before the Devil's Den dive, secured against his truck, with the money deposited in his checking account and then quickly transferred to an account at a different bank. That account had been opened just days before the transfer under the name of a corporation called Coastal Explorations, LLC, registered to Walsh's home address. Santos pulled corporate records for Coastal Explorations and found that Walsh had registered it in December 2019 with a stated business purpose of underwater photography and videography services. He'd listed himself as CEO and sole proprietor. The company had no employees, no website, no apparent business operations. It appeared to exist only to receive money from Walsh's personal accounts, money that was then withdrawn in cash or transferred to other accounts that investigators had difficulty tracing. The pattern suggested Walsh had been moving money in preparation for something, possibly planning to disappear or possibly setting up financing for a project he didn't want to be directly associated with. Detective Santos brought her findings to the Levy County State Attorney's Office, presenting what she called a preliminary case for treating Garrett Walsh as a suspect rather than a victim. The state attorney assigned an assistant state attorney named Jennifer Park to review the evidence and determine if prosecution was warranted and against whom. Park was skeptical initially, pointing out that prosecuting a dead man was pointless and that without bodies there was no way to prove anyone was actually dead rather than missing. But Santos had anticipated that argument, and she had a theory. What if Garrett Walsh didn't die in the cave? Santos said. What if he survived and staged his own disappearance, using Madison Cruz and Kyle Brennan as cover? Think about the pattern. He takes 2 students into an unmapped cave, they never come back, and everyone assumes all 3 died in an accident. But Walsh had been planning something for months, moving money, setting up corporate shells. What if the dive was a setup from the beginning? What if he left Madison and Kyle in the cave, maybe trapped or already dead, and then surfaced and disappeared while everyone was searching for bodies underwater? Park considered the theory, playing devil's advocate. If Walsh survived and disappeared, where did he go? His vehicle was still in the parking lot. His wallet and keys were there. How did he leave the area without transportation? Santos had thought about that too. He could have had an accomplice waiting nearby, someone who picked him up and drove him away while the search operation was focused underwater. Or he could have surfaced, walked out through the woods, and been picked up on a nearby road. Devil's Den is remote, but not inaccessible. If Walsh surfaced away from the main spring entrance, he could have left the area without anyone at Devil's Den knowing. Park asked the critical question. Why? Why would an experienced cave diving instructor fake his own death? What did he gain? Santos pulled out the financial records again. Walsh was $38,000 in debt in February 2020, she said. Credit cards maxed out, personal loan late on his rent. He was about to lose his truck and his equipment. But a week before the Devil's Den dive, he transferred $20,000 to that coastal explorations account and withdrew most of it in cash. If he was planning to disappear, he needed liquid assets he could take with him. And he needed a cover story that would explain why he vanished. 3 people dying in a cave accident is a tragedy that stops investigation. 1 instructor disappearing while his students die is a criminal case that gets pursued relentlessly. Park was quiet for a long moment, then said, "You need to find Garrett Walsh. If he's alive, if he staged this, then we have a murder case. If he's dead in that cave with the others, then we have an accidental death with negligence factors. But either way, we need to know, and we need to find those bodies. 4 years of exposure to water and cave conditions will make identification difficult, but we need remains for legal declarations and closure for the families." Santos contacted the International Underwater Cave Rescue and Recovery Organization, explaining the new evidence and requesting a specialized dive team to conduct a comprehensive search of Devil's Den, including any unexplored restrictions that might lead to deeper passages. The organization assigned a 4-person team led by a diver named Brett Williamson, who had 30 years of cave diving experience and had participated in some of the most challenging recovery operations in the world. Williamson reviewed the dive computer data and the voice recorder transcript, and he told Santos that if Walsh had found a new passage, finding it again wouldn't be difficult for experienced divers, but accessing it might be extremely dangerous depending on the restriction's size and condition. The dive team arrived at Devil's Den 5 days after Antonio Reyes found the brass key, bringing specialized equipment, including side-mount configuration tanks that allowed passage through tighter restrictions, high-powered underwater lights, and a remotely operated vehicle about the size of a briefcase that could squeeze through gaps too small for divers. The team spent 2 days surveying the known cave system, documenting current conditions and identifying potential unexplored areas. On the 3rd day, they found what they were looking for. At the back of the main chamber, at a depth of 48 feet on the northeast wall, there was a restriction in the limestone that had been noted in previous surveys but never explored. The restriction was narrow, maybe 16 inches at its widest point, and it angled downward at 30 degrees. Previous surveyors had assumed it was a dead end or too tight for safe passage. But when Williamson's team deployed their ROV through the restriction, the camera revealed that it opened after about 12 feet into a vertical shaft that descended into darkness beyond the ROV's light range. Williamson reviewed the ROV footage and made the decision to personally explore the restriction. He configured his gear for maximum streamlining using side-mount tanks and removing all non-essential equipment, and he briefed his team on safety protocols. If he became stuck or encountered problems, they'd initiate rescue procedures that included bringing in additional divers and equipment if necessary. The dive would be fully documented on video, and Williamson would maintain constant communication with his surface team via a specialized underwater communication system that used low-frequency sound waves. If you're following this story and understanding how a hidden key and a voice recorder are unraveling a mystery that law enforcement thought was unsolvable, maybe you'll consider subscribing, because technical diving investigations like this one require incredible expertise and courage, and telling these stories honors both the victims and the professionals who work to bring them answers. Williamson entered the water at 9:30 a.m. on a Tuesday morning, descended to the restriction, and carefully maneuvered through the tight passage. His video feed showed the walls closing around him, limestone scraping his tanks, and then suddenly opening into the vertical shaft the ROV had revealed. He descended the shaft slowly, monitoring his depth gauge. At 70 feet, he reached the bottom of the shaft, which opened into a horizontal passage about 3 feet high and 4 feet wide. The passage extended beyond his light range in both directions. Williamson chose to go right, following the passage for approximately 100 feet before it opened into a chamber. The chamber was roughly 30 feet across and 15 feet high, and it was extraordinary. The walls were covered in formations, stalactites and flowstone and helictites that had been growing for thousands of years. It was the kind of room that would make any cave diver's reputation, the kind of discovery that got published in National Geographic. And scattered across the chamber floor were signs of human presence. A guideline reel with temporary line running back toward the entrance, a dive slate with navigation notes, stage tanks stacked against one wall, and most significantly, 2 bodies in technical diving gear, lying near the center of the chamber in positions that suggested they'd died there and had never been moved. Williamson reported his findings to the surface team, his voice deliberately calm despite what he was seeing. 2 deceased divers in technical configuration, he said. Bodies appear to have been in place for an extended period, significant decomposition. I'm going to document the scene and then withdraw. This is now a recovery operation requiring specialized protocols. The surface team acknowledged and contacted Detective Santos, who was standing by at the spring entrance. Santos immediately secured Devil's Den as a crime scene, preventing anyone from entering or leaving, and contacted the medical examiner's office to prepare for body recovery. Over the next 3 days, Williamson's team conducted a careful recovery operation, documenting everything in the chamber before removing the bodies. The remains were identified through personal effects and subsequently through dental records as Madison Cruz and Kyle Brennan. The medical examiner's preliminary assessment was that both had died from drowning, likely from hypoxia after running out of breathing gas or from panic in the confined space. The bodies showed no obvious trauma beyond what would be expected from 4 years of decomposition in water. Time of death was estimated as consistent with February 2020 based on decomposition rates and equipment condition. But the scene told a more complex story. The stage tanks found in the chamber were labeled with Garrett Walsh's name, and analysis showed they'd been nearly full when they'd been left there. Madison and Kyle had both been found with their primary tanks empty and their backup regulators in their mouths, suggesting they'd run out of gas and died trying to breathe from empty tanks. But if Walsh's stage tanks had been available and full, why hadn't Madison and Kyle used them? The only explanation that made sense was that the tanks had been inaccessible, either deliberately hidden or placed out of reach by Walsh after he'd convinced the students to continue deeper into the cave beyond their gas supply. Further exploration of the chamber revealed a second passage leading away from the main room, this one ascending back towards shallower water. Williamson followed it for 50 feet before it opened into a different part of the Devil's Den cave system, an area that was well mapped and easily accessible from the main chamber without going through the tight restriction. The passage was large enough that a diver could easily pass through it, and it showed signs of recent use, scrape marks on the walls, and disturbed silt that suggested someone had navigated it within the past few years. The implications were clear. Garrett Walsh had known about both entrances to the chamber. He'd taken Madison and Kyle through the tight restriction, convincing them it was the only way in, and then he'd exited through the easy passage, leaving them trapped. Maybe he'd intended to come back for them, and something had prevented it. Or maybe he'd never intended to come back at all, had deliberately trapped them in a place where they'd run out of gas and die while he staged his disappearance. Either way, he'd left them to die while he escaped. Detective Santos issued a warrant for Garrett Walsh's arrest on 2 counts of second-degree murder, based on the theory that he'd recklessly caused the deaths of Madison Cruz and Kyle Brennan through deliberate endangerment and abandonment. But arresting Walsh required finding him first, and that meant answering the question of where he'd been for the past 4 years. Santos assembled a team of investigators and started working through Walsh's background, looking for patterns that might indicate where he'd go if he was trying to disappear. Walsh's family was limited. His parents were both deceased. He had one sister who lived in Oregon and claimed they hadn't spoken in 5 years, and he'd never been married or had children. His friends were mostly in the diving community, and Santos interviewed dozens of them, looking for anyone who'd heard from Walsh since February 2020. Most were shocked at the allegations, insisting Walsh had been a dedicated instructor who'd never shown signs of being willing to kill students for personal gain. But a few mentioned that Walsh had talked about leaving the country, about teaching diving in Mexico or Belize, where regulations were looser and opportunities were greater. Santos contacted Interpol and the FBI's International Operations Division, providing Walsh's information and requesting alerts at border crossings and known expatriate communities in Central America and the Caribbean. She also worked with financial investigators to trace the money Walsh had moved in the months before the Devil's Den dive. The trail was complex, running through multiple shell corporations and cryptocurrency exchanges, but eventually investigators identified approximately $15,000 that had been converted to Bitcoin in early February 2020 and transferred to an exchange that operated in the Cayman Islands. The Cayman Islands connection led to cooperation with Royal Cayman Islands Police Service, and within 2 weeks, investigators had identified activity on accounts associated with Walsh's shell corporations. Small transactions, mostly cash withdrawals from ATMs in Georgetown, suggesting someone was living off the funds Walsh had staged before his disappearance. The RCIPS surveilled ATMs that showed the activity pattern and eventually captured video of a man matching Walsh's description, slightly heavier than he'd been in 2020 and with longer hair, but recognizable through facial recognition software that gave a 78% confidence match. RCIPS officers arrested the man as he was leaving an ATM on 7 Mile Beach, and he immediately identified himself as Garrett Walsh, though he claimed he was a permanent resident of the Cayman Islands and demanded to speak to an attorney. Extradition proceedings began, with the U.S. State Department coordinating with Caymanian authorities. Walsh fought the extradition, but ultimately lost when evidence was presented showing he'd entered the Cayman Islands on false documentation and had been living there illegally. He was transported to Florida and arraigned on 2 counts of second-degree murder, 2 counts of manslaughter, and multiple counts related to financial fraud and false reporting. The trial began 18 months after Antonio Reyes found the brass key, and it lasted 6 weeks. The prosecution presented the evidence methodically. The voice recorder showing Walsh pressuring students, the dive computer data showing they'd entered an area Walsh claimed to have explored previously, the chamber layout showing Walsh could have exited through an alternate route while leaving Madison and Kyle trapped, the financial records showing Walsh had staged his disappearance, and the evidence that he'd been living under an assumed name in the Cayman Islands, while everyone believed he was dead. The defense argued that the dive had been a tragic accident, that Walsh had panicked when he realized the students were in trouble, that he'd attempted to rescue them but had been forced to surface to save his own life, and that he'd fled afterwards because he knew he'd be blamed for their deaths, even though he hadn't intended to harm them. The defense presented Walsh's diving record, showing he'd successfully trained hundreds of students over 12 years without previous fatalities, and they argued that the financial moves had been unrelated to the dive, simply attempts to manage debt that had coincidentally occurred around the same time. The prosecution's rebuttal was devastating. If Walsh had attempted rescue and failed, why had his stage tanks been found full in the chamber where the students died? If he'd panicked and surfaced, why had he exited through a different passage than the one he'd entered? And if the dive was truly an accident, why had he staged a false identity and fled to the Cayman Islands, instead of reporting the deaths and cooperating with the investigation? The prosecution played Madison Cruz's voice from the recorder, her words saying, "I'm leaving a record of this conversation. If something goes wrong, people need to know this wasn't our decision." And the courtroom was silent when the recording ended. The jury deliberated for 14 hours over 3 days before reaching a verdict: guilty on both counts of second-degree murder, guilty on both counts of manslaughter, guilty on all financial fraud charges. The judge sentenced Walsh to 2 consecutive life terms without possibility of parole, ensuring he'd die in prison. Walsh maintained his innocence through the sentencing, claiming he was a scapegoat for a tragic accident, but the judge was unmoved. "You pressured 2 young people into a dive they told you they weren't comfortable with," the judge said. "You took them into an unmapped cave without proper support or emergency protocols, and when they ran into trouble, you saved yourself and left them to die. Then you staged your own death and lived comfortably in the Caribbean, while their families spent 4 years wondering what happened to them. That's not an accident. That's murder. You'll spend the rest of your life in prison, and that's more mercy than you showed Madison Cruz and Kyle Brennan." The families of Madison Cruz and Kyle Brennan finally held funerals, 4 years after the disappearance, but only months after their remains were recovered. Madison's service was held in Gainesville, attended by hundreds of people from the University Diving Club, where she'd been president, and from the Marine Biology Department, where she'd been pursuing her doctorate. Alexis Cruz gave a eulogy that focused on her sister's passion for underwater exploration and her dedication to understanding and protecting marine ecosystems. She talked about how Madison had always been careful, had always followed safety protocols, and how she tried to refuse the dive that killed her. The fact that Garrett Walsh had pressured her into it, had manipulated her fear of losing her certification, made Madison's death not just tragic but criminal, Alexis said. Her sister had done everything right, and she'd died anyway because someone in authority had abused that authority. Kyle Brennan's funeral was held in Tampa, where his parents and younger brother still lived. Kyle had been working as a marine engineer, diving on offshore platforms, and his co-workers filled the church, telling stories about his skill and his humor and his careful approach to dangerous work. Kyle's father gave a brief statement saying that his son had died because he'd trusted someone who didn't deserve trust, and that the only consolation was that Garrett Walsh would spend his life in prison, paying for what he'd done. It wasn't enough, Kyle's father said. Nothing would ever be enough. But it was something. Antonio Reyes, the plumber whose discovery of a brass key had broken the case open, attended both funerals at the family's invitation. He was uncomfortable with the attention, felt like he'd just been doing his job and happened to find something important. But he understood that the families needed to thank him. Alexis Cruz hugged him at Madison's service and said that her sister had left that key, knowing someone would find it eventually, and Antonio had been the person Madison had faith in, even though she'd never met him. That meant something, Alexis said. That mattered. The diving community's response to the case was complicated. Most instructors were horrified by Walsh's actions, seeing them as a betrayal of the trust that students placed in teachers and as a violation of every principle that made cave diving possible. New protocols were developed, requiring dive plans to be filed electronically with third-party monitoring services, making it harder for instructors to deviate from planned routes without documentation. Certification agencies updated their standards to include more explicit language about student rights, to refuse dives they weren't comfortable with, and to make clear that instructors who pressured students would face immediate suspension and criminal referral. But some in the community questioned whether the response was overreach, whether new regulations would make cave diving instruction too restrictive and would prevent the kind of aggressive training that produced highly skilled divers. These voices were quieter after the trial, especially after expert testimony had made clear just how reckless Walsh's actions had been, but the debate continued in online forums and at diving conferences. The balance between pushing students to develop skills and protecting them from unacceptable risk was a line that every instructor had to navigate, and the Walsh case had shown how catastrophically wrong things could go when that line was crossed. Detective Maria Santos continued to work underwater death investigations for FDLE, but the Walsh case stayed with her in ways that other cases didn't. She'd been right that something was wrong with the original investigation, that the clean disappearance of 3 divers without trace had been suspicious enough to warrant deeper scrutiny. But it had taken 4 years and a lucky find by a plumber for the truth to surface. How many other cases were out there where evidence existed but hadn't been found? How many disappearances that seemed straightforward were actually crimes that would never be solved because the crucial evidence was hidden in a place nobody thought to look? She started teaching a course for law enforcement on underwater investigations, using the Walsh case as a primary example. The key lessons were about thinking beyond obvious explanations, about understanding that cave diving culture had its own dynamics that made some people reluctant to report problems, and about the importance of technical experts who could interpret evidence like dive computer data that made no sense to laypersons. The course was popular, drawing investigators from across the southeast, and several attendees credited it with helping them solve cold cases in their own jurisdictions. Brett Williamson, the lead diver who'd found Madison and Kyle's bodies, continued working with the International Underwater Cave Rescue and Recovery Organization, but the Walsh case changed how he approached recoveries. He'd seen plenty of diving fatalities caused by poor judgment or equipment failure or bad luck, but he'd never encountered a case where an instructor had deliberately trapped students and left them to die. The cynicism that might have generated was tempered by seeing the investigative system work, seeing how multiple agencies had cooperated to bring Walsh to justice. But Williamson found himself being more suspicious of instructor narratives when he was called to incident sites. Trust but verify had always been important in technical diving. Now it felt essential. The chamber where Madison and Kyle had died, the room that Garrett Walsh had been so eager to document and claim as his discovery, was closed to diving by the Devil's Den management after the recovery operation concluded. A gate was installed at the restriction, preventing access to the tight passage Walsh had used, and warning signs were posted in the main chamber explaining that the area beyond was closed due to hazardous conditions and recent fatalities. The chamber's formations, the stalactites and flowstone that Walsh had wanted to photograph, would remain undocumented and unseen except by the few divers who'd participated in the recovery operation. That seemed appropriate somehow. The room had been a tomb for 4 years. It didn't deserve to become a tourist attraction. Alexis Cruz continued teaching at the University of Florida, focusing her research on marine conservation and the impact of human activity on coastal ecosystems. She established a scholarship fund in Madison's name for students pursuing careers in marine biology, and she volunteered with diving safety organizations, giving talks about the importance of questioning authority and refusing dives that exceeded your training or comfort level. The talks were popular with students who appreciated hearing from someone who'd lost a family member to diving accident and who could speak authentically about the risks and the importance of safety culture. She stayed in touch with Kyle Brennan's family, the two families connected by shared tragedy and shared justice. They gathered annually on February 14th, the anniversary of the dive that killed Madison and Kyle, not to dwell on grief, but to remember their loved ones fully, to celebrate what they'd accomplished and to acknowledge what they'd never get to accomplish. The gatherings were small, immediate family and close friends, and they usually involved looking at photos and telling stories and making sure that Madison and Kyle remained more than just victims in a criminal case. On the 5th anniversary of the dive, Alexis and Kyle's brother David went diving together at a different spring, one that was open water without caves, and they placed memorial plaques underwater that honored Madison and Kyle's passion for diving while acknowledging the dangers that came with it. The plaques were mounted on limestone outcroppings at 30 feet, visible to anyone who dove the site, and they included photos and brief biographies and a warning: know your limits. Question authority. Dive safely. It wasn't comprehensive, couldn't capture everything Madison and Kyle had been or everything that had gone wrong that February day, but it was something tangible that would outlast everyone who remembered them personally. Antonio Reyes went back to plumbing, though he found he couldn't quite forget about the brass key and what it had led to. He started paying more attention to what he found when he was excavating or repairing, looking for things that seemed out of place, documenting unusual items before dismissing them as trash. He never found anything as significant as Madison's key, but he did find several items that turned out to be relevant to other investigations. Lost jewelry that was returned to owners, a wallet that had been missing for 2 years, evidence of a burglary that helped police close a case. His co-workers started calling him Detective Reyes, teasing but also respectful, acknowledging that he'd developed a skill for noticing what others missed. He was invited to speak at a law enforcement conference about the importance of civilian reporting, about how someone doing routine work could discover evidence that broke major cases if they were observant and willing to make a phone call. Antonio was nervous about public speaking, but agreed because he felt like he owed it to Madison and Kyle to keep their story alive, to make sure other people understood that sometimes the key to solving a mystery was literally a key, hidden in a place that would eventually be found if someone looked closely enough. The Devil's Den Spring continued operating as a diving site, though attendance dropped significantly in the year following the recovery operation and trial. People were uncomfortable diving where 2 young people had died, where an instructor had committed murder and staged his disappearance. But gradually traffic returned, new divers who hadn't known about the case, and experienced divers who understood that Devil's Den itself wasn't dangerous, that the deaths had resulted from someone deliberately leading students into unacceptable risk. The Springs management implemented new safety protocols, requiring all technical divers to register their dive plans electronically and to check out when they surfaced. The system wasn't perfect, but it helped, creating a documentation trail that would make another disappearance like the Walsh case more difficult to hide. The NSS Cave Diving Section commissioned an independent review of the Walsh case, looking for systematic issues that might have allowed him to operate undetected for so long. The review found that Walsh had been skilled at compartmentalizing his activities, teaching conservative courses most of the time, while occasionally pushing boundaries with students he thought wouldn't report him. The review also found gaps in the certification agency's oversight, with insufficient mechanisms for students to report instructor misconduct without fear of retaliation. Recommendations included anonymous reporting systems, more rigorous instructor audits, and mandatory incident reporting for any dive that deviated from filed plans. Most certification agencies adopted some or all of these recommendations. Though implementation varied, the industry was decentralized, with multiple competing agencies that didn't always agree on standards, and getting universal adoption of new safety protocols was difficult. But the Walsh case had been prominent enough that most agencies recognized they needed to do something, and over the following years, the culture shifted toward more transparency and more student protections. It wasn't perfect, would never be perfect, because human nature and authority dynamics were difficult to completely regulate, but it was better. If you've stayed with this story through all its technical detail and painful revelations, through the investigation and trial and aftermath, you understand something important about how evidence works in criminal cases. Sometimes the crucial piece is hidden, deliberately concealed by someone who knew the truth and wanted it found. Madison Cruz's brass key wasn't just a personal item, it was a message A way of saying that if things went wrong, someone should look harder because the official story wasn't complete. That's remarkable foresight for someone about to go diving, and it saved the case from remaining unsolved forever. If you believe that stories like this one deserve to be told completely and honestly, if you think these lessons matter, turn on notifications because there are more cases out there where evidence exists but hasn't been found yet. And telling these stories might help someone else recognize when they've stumbled onto something important. Garrett Walsh spent his first 5 years in prison claiming he was innocent, filing appeals that were uniformly denied, insisting that he'd panicked and made bad decisions but hadn't murdered anyone. But in year 6, facing the reality that he'd die in prison regardless of what he claimed, he gave an interview to a journalist researching a book about cave diving fatalities. In the interview, Walsh admitted what everyone had suspected. He'd known the dive was dangerous, had known Madison and Kyle weren't ready for it, but he'd been desperate to document the chamber before someone else found it. His career had been failing, his debts were crushing him, and he'd thought one spectacular discovery could turn everything around. When things had gone wrong in the chamber, when Madison and Kyle had started panicking about their gas supply, Walsh said he'd tried to calm them, but they'd been too frightened to listen. He'd made the decision to surface and get help, but as he was exiting through the easy passage, he'd realized that bringing back rescuers would mean admitting he'd violated every safety protocol in the book. He'd lose his certifications, face criminal charges, probably go to prison. So he'd kept going, had surfaced in a different part of the cave system, had walked out through the woods, and had called a friend who picked him up on a nearby highway. The friend had helped him stage his disappearance, driven him to Miami, and from there Walsh had made his way to the Cayman Islands using false documents he'd prepared months earlier. He'd intended to come back eventually, Walsh said, had told himself he'd figure out a way to report the deaths anonymously so the bodies could be recovered. But as days became weeks and weeks became months, it became easier to stay disappeared than to face what he'd done. He'd followed news coverage of the search, had seen the families pleading for information, and he'd felt guilt that he described as consuming. But not enough to turn himself in, not enough to face justice voluntarily. Only when he'd been caught had he accepted that he'd have to answer for his decisions. The journalist asked Walsh if he regretted the dive. And Walsh said of course he did, that he thought about Madison and Kyle every day, that he understood he'd destroyed lives for no good reason. But when pressed about whether he'd do anything differently, knowing what he knew now, Walsh admitted that until everything went wrong, he thought he was taking acceptable risks, that he'd believed his experience would keep everyone safe. It was a chilling admission, showing that even after years in prison, Walsh still didn't fully grasp that his judgment had been catastrophically flawed from the beginning, that pressuring students into dangerous dives was wrong regardless of outcome. The journalist's book was published 7 years after the brass key was found, and it sold well, becoming a cautionary tale about authority and responsibility in dangerous sports. The book included interviews with the families, with investigators, with cave diving experts, and with Antonio Reyes, whose discovery had made the entire investigation possible. Critics praised the book for its thorough reporting and its refusal to sensationalize, for treating the victims as complete people rather than just names in a tragedy. Alexis Cruz wrote in a review that the book honored her sister's memory by telling the truth completely, including the mistakes Madison had made in trusting someone who didn't deserve trust. Detective Santos was promoted to supervisor of FDLE's Underwater Investigation Unit, and she used her position to advocate for more resources and better training for officers who worked these cases. She pushed for standardized protocols that would be followed at every underwater death scene, ensuring evidence wouldn't be missed because local departments didn't know what to look for. She also advocated for more cooperation between law enforcement and the technical diving community, recognizing that solving cases like the Walsh investigation required expertise that most officers didn't possess, and that building relationships with expert divers was essential. The case was used in law schools as an example of circumstantial evidence prosecution, showing how multiple pieces of evidence that each seemed minor could combine into overwhelming proof of guilt. The voice recorder, the dive computer data, the chamber layout, the financial records, and the defendant's flight to the Cayman Islands, each piece alone might not have been sufficient for conviction, but together they painted a picture that was undeniable. Law students studying the case learned about building comprehensive narratives from fragmentary evidence, about how physical evidence and witness testimony and financial records could corroborate each other, and about how defense attorneys tried to create doubt by attacking individual pieces rather than addressing the overall pattern. 10 years after the brass key was found, Alexis Cruz returned to Devil's Den for the first time since the recovery operation. She came alone, on a weekday when the spring was quiet, and she stood at the edge of the water looking down into the blue-green clarity that had drawn her sister to diving in the first place. She understood the attraction, the sense of entering another world where gravity and light and physics worked differently, where exploration meant discovering spaces that existed outside human experience. But she also understood the risks, the way that confined spaces and limited gas and human judgment could combine into fatal situations. She didn't dive. She'd never been certified and had no plans to pursue it. But she sat by the water for several hours, thinking about Madison, about the person her sister had been and the person she'd never get to become. Madison would have been 34, probably teaching at a university somewhere, possibly married or starting a family, definitely still diving because the passion for underwater exploration had been core to who she was. All that potential had been extinguished in a limestone chamber 70 feet underwater, because an instructor had valued his reputation more than his students' lives. Alexis had brought something with her, a small bronze plaque that she'd had made without asking permission from the spring management. The plaque read, "In memory of Madison Cruz and Kyle Brennan, cave divers, died February 14th, 2020. They trusted their instructor." She attached it to a limestone outcropping near the main entrance, using marine epoxy that would be difficult to remove, and she took photos to send to Kyle's family. The spring management might take it down eventually, but it would be there for a while, a reminder to every diver who entered the water that trust was a gift that could be betrayed, that authority figures weren't always right, that sometimes refusing to dive was the smartest decision you could make. As she was leaving, a young couple arrived with diving gear, clearly students doing their open water certification dives. They were excited, talking about how they'd always wanted to try diving, and how Devil's Den was supposed to be perfect for beginners. Alexis almost approached them, almost told them to be careful and to question anyone who pushed them beyond their comfort level. But she decided against it. They had to learn their own way, make their own decisions about risk and trust. All she could do was honor her sister's memory and tell Madison's story whenever someone was willing to listen, and hope that somewhere, sometime, that story would make someone think twice before agreeing to a dive they weren't ready for. She drove away from Devil's Den thinking about what Detective Santos had said at the trial, testimony about how Madison had left multiple pieces of evidence, how she'd known something was wrong and had done everything she could to make sure the truth would eventually surface. The brass key, the voice recorder, the notes about the dive plan, all of it had been Madison's way of fighting back against someone who thought he could commit murder and get away with it. And she'd been right. The evidence had survived, had been found, had led to justice. It had taken 4 years and had required multiple people to recognize the significance of what they were seeing. But Madison's plan had worked. That was something Alexis could hold on to, the knowledge that her sister had been smart and capable until the very end, that Madison had understood she was in danger and had tried to protect herself and Kyle even when it hadn't been enough to save their lives. The brass key hadn't been a random good luck charm. It had been a deliberate insurance policy, a message from someone who knew that if you were going into danger, you should leave a trail for people to follow. That was the kind of person Madison had been, thoughtful and prepared and always thinking ahead ways. And that's how Alexis chose to remember her, not as a victim, but as someone who'd fought back in the only way available and who'd ultimately won, even though the victory came too late to save her. The story ends here because the essential arc is complete. Evidence found, justice achieved, families given closure that was incomplete but real. Garrett Walsh will die in prison. Antonio Reyes will keep noticing things other people miss. Alexis Cruz will keep telling her sister's story. And somewhere, a diving student will refuse a dive they're not comfortable with because they've heard about what happened at Devil's Den, and they've learned that sometimes the most important decision you make underwater is the decision not to dive at all. That's Madison's legacy, along with the brass key that now sits in an evidence locker as part of a closed case file, a small piece of metal that broke open a mystery and proved that sometimes the crucial evidence is exactly where someone left it, waiting patiently to be found by someone who recognized its importance and was willing to make a phone call. The plumber, the key, the hidden voice recorder, the chamber 70 feet down, all pieces of a story that took 4 years to tell completely, but that finally, eventually, told the truth about what happened to 3 divers who entered Devil's Den one February afternoon and only 1 came back. That's what matters. Truth matters. Justice matters. And the people we lose deserve to have their stories told completely, honestly, and with the understanding that sometimes evil wins in the moment, but loses in the long arc when good people refuse to stop looking for answers.